the amount we are approving today or tomorrow, Honorable Speaker, of 3.9 will remain throughout the year. Honorable Speaker, experience and practice has confirmed to us that there is what we call in-year deviations. For example, this year, Honorable Speaker, this House approved a budget deficit of 4.4%. As at now, it has been adjusted upwards, Honorable Speaker, to 5.5%. And the question is, in the process of this adjustment, even though it can be justified, but was this House involved in making that decision? And I think, Honorable Speaker, if we have to be effective as a House, because you have a committee on public debt, it is important that where we realize in-year deviations, then these deviations, Honorable Speaker, are also discussed by the House and approved. The other matter, Honorable Speaker, in the process of discussing this, thing, just a few things I want to note. The issue of average interest rates has been an issue. They have increased, leading to more, in terms of total amounts for loans increasing. The issue of average maturity to average time to maturity of loans, Honorable Speaker, is getting shorter, making it worse for us. The issue of exchange rate, Honorable Speaker, is another issue we can't ignore as we discuss public debt matters. The other important issue, Honorable Speaker, is we approved a debt anchor of 55%, and we said we need to see it going down. At that time, it was 63. Now it has gone to 69 of the GDP. Instead of decreasing, it is increasing. We need an explanation as a House as to why, instead of decreasing, the figure is increasing. We don't have that explanation, Honorable Speaker. As our
okay. Order, honorable members. I now propose the question at order number 14, that this House adopts the report of the Public Debt and Privatization Committee on its consideration of the 2024 medium-term debt management strategy laid on the table of the House on Thursday, 29th February 2024, and pursuant to the provision of Section 15(4) of the Public Finance Management Act 2012 and Standing Order 232A 7 and 8. A, approves the 2024 medium-term debt management strategy, and B, makes the policy and financial resolutions contained in the schedule to the order paper. Before I give the contributors, allow me to acknowledge the following schools in the public and speakers gallery. In the speakers gallery, we have Moi Girls School, Nairobi, Kibra, in Nairobi County. And in the public gallery, we have St. Francis Secondary School, Subukia, Nakuru County. On your behalf and on my own behalf, I welcome the students and their teachers to the House of Parliament. Now, honorable members, I see the screen is full. I believe you have logged in on this. Julius Melly. Majority, you want to be the first to go? Okay.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. And Honorable Speaker, I rise to support and allow me, Honorable Speaker, to first begin by thanking.
Remember, those who are contributing to this, in a procedural motion on limitation of debate, time is 5 minutes for each and every contributor, including the majority leader.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. And I hope the clerk has noted you took about 30 seconds of the 5 minutes. Honorable Speaker, I was thanking the chair of the committee and members of the committee, led by Honorable Makali Mulu, who is a very diligent member of this committee, and the chair. Honorable Speaker, I rise to support this report. And many of the recommendations, Honorable Speaker, especially regarding our fiscal consolidation process from the 3.9 that is envisaged in the next financial year, 24-25, to the 3.3 in the medium term, the 2 years following the next financial year, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, as we speak about fiscal consolidation, The fiscal consolidation program, Honorable Speaker, will encompass two aspects of it, both revenue generation, and that I'm sure the Finance Committee will later in the year be bringing their Finance Bill 2025 that will deal with matters to do with revenue generation. But more importantly, Honorable Speaker, is on expenditure and how we are able to rationalize our expenditure as a country. And this is where we've had a huge challenge. And if you listen to what the Honorable Makali Mulu was saying, the media changes usually emanate from reviews of our expenditure, Honorable Speaker, where every supplementary budget comes with additional expenditure at the time when revenues are also not growing, but revenues are going down. And I do hope, Honorable Speaker, that the National Treasury this time round will adhere to what the committee and the House is recommending should we adopt this report as it is and the recommendations of the committee as they are. That, Honorable Speaker, if the National Treasury discovers within the year that our revenues are either not performing or improving, then it is imperative that they also review the expenditure side of our budget, because that is a challenge we've had. And the Honorable Dindi Nyoro, our chair of the Budget and Appropriations Committee, I know has been very keen on this, but I want to ask him that this year we must actualize what we say as a House. That because the National Treasury, and indeed not the National Treasury, I heard somebody say the other day that even our counties have borrowed from their big brother in the national government. We are seeing county government also doing budgets based on projected revenues that are never realizable. In my own county, Honorable Speaker, half year, I think we are at 1 point something billion shillings against a projection of 8 billion shillings. 7.98 billion shillings. And it's impossible in the next half year or 4 or 5 months to the end of the financial year to achieve the revenue targets that they had. And the same happens, Honorable Speaker, for our national government. And therefore, it's imperative that the National Treasury, when they realize KRA is not up to speed in terms of the revenue that they had projected, they review expenditure downwards. Probably, Honorable Speaker, it is time, and the Budget and Appropriations Committee has food for thought on whether do we put an embargo on new expenditure. And I know this has been there, but we need to make sure that additional capital expenditure is checked. Honorable Speaker, the other thing that we must check is our recurrent expenditure. Honorable Speaker, I am seeing in the newspapers advertisements for jobs every now and then in the public service, and many of them may not necessarily be replacements of people who have left the offices, Honorable Speaker. And this, at the end of the day, will lead to very huge recurrent expenditure that will negate the fiscal consolidation that we are trying to pursue. Honorable Speaker, as I conclude, let me say that the National Treasury, as I said, must ensure that fiscal consolidation is not just a term that exists in our books and in these reports, that it is something that they must actualize this time round, Honorable Speaker. And with that, I beg to support.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity to also contribute to this debate. Mr. Speaker, two things come to mind on this issue of our debt strategy. First, I think we must be very, very careful as members of Parliament before we vote, what exactly we are voting for. Because this is the beginning of the budget cycle, and if we are not clear about what is happening, we may just agree to things and later on we start complaining. So we must note as members, this is the beginning of the budget cycle. The debt strategy is part of it, and we must be careful what we vote for. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, we also must be careful as politicians what we say, even when it is during campaign time. Because, Mr. Speaker, there are things that we have to do eventually, and sometimes it is very, very humiliating and humbling for people to eat humble pie. Because, Mr. Speaker, you note that when we passed the last finance bill, there are some parts of that finance bill that later on members who had accepted them went out there and started complaining publicly. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, when you look at this strategy, it actually, passing these enables and allows the government of Kenya Kwanza to borrow more. And you must remember the promises that were made during the campaign trail, We were told that borrowing, in fact, they demonized the previous head of state, and apparently borrowing was supposedly a very bad thing. And now we are continuing to borrow. We are planning to borrow. We are setting up ourselves to borrow some more money. Mr. Speaker, it is, in fact, I can say that this regime can teach a lot to the previous regime on borrowing, because they are now going further into using other marketing instruments like green and blue bonds, samurai bonds, panda bonds, sukuk bonds, among others. So basically, there is a better and more intention of borrowing from this strategy. But Mr. Speaker, borrowing is not necessarily a bad thing, because even in our own investments, we borrow so that we can do good things with that money. What matters is what exactly do you use the money for? Exactly how do you spend that money? If you borrow and put up an investment that returns, it gives you good returns, then it's a good investment. But Mr. Speaker, if you borrow and consume and use that money for normal day-to-day operations, then that becomes a problem. Mr. Speaker, it's also a problem, and this is what is happening. When you borrow to pay back loans, Mr. Speaker, it is not a good strategy to borrow so you can pay back loans. And unfortunately, I am seeing a tendency where the current borrowing is at a much higher cost than the previous borrowing. So you're borrowing so you can settle loans that were borrowed at lower interest rates, and you are paying higher interest rates based on the plan that is there now. Mr. Speaker, we have to be careful about these things. But Mr. Speaker, I also think it's unfortunate that there is a lot of borrowing from the local market. Mr. Speaker, one of the things that the former president, the late President Kibaki did, is that he stopped borrowing from the local market. Mr. Speaker, immediately that happened, it opened up and stopped crowding out the private sector. So people with businesses were able to take loans from banks. In fact, before Kibaki, even opening accounts with some of these banks, some of these major banks, was almost impossible, because even the minimum deposits were so high, because they were dealing directly with the government. So, Mr. Speaker, it is actually something that we need to look at. Why allow ourselves or government to borrow from the local market and crowd out the private sector? Mr. Speaker, I also want to point out that Treasury, Mr. Speaker, is not taking this house seriously. And Mr. Speaker, you are aware that several times Treasury has told this house that they will release funds for GAF, for GCDF, and they didn't honor it, I think about 4 times. Mr. Speaker, I'm saying that because if you look at the policy resolutions, they actually confirm what I am saying. The policy resolution number 5 says that within 30 days of the adoption of this report and subject to Section 50 of the Public Finance Management Act, Treasury will submit a comprehensive report to the National Assembly on the breach of the debt anchor of 55% to GDP. Mr. Speaker, we are at about 70.8% to GDP. That means that when they gave an undertaking, they did not fulfill it. And now we are giving them time to go and fulfill something they didn't fulfill when they had the opportunity. Mr. Speaker, again, in the last discussions on this strategy, medium-term debt strategy, we talked about Treasury opening a single account. Mr. Speaker, we are repeating ourselves. 12 months.
Time is up. Joseph McClap. Is not there. Mboko Milemba. Yes. You are on intervention.
Microphone. Thank you, Honorable Speaker, for this chance to speak on this medium-term debt management strategy. Basically, the medium-term debt management strategy and things to do with this were basically things of the IMF. And they were supposed to make the countries know how they will fix the deficits that are in their budgets. But I also believe greatly that this must be customized to different countries. In this case, it needs to be customized to Kenya so that it can work well for Kenya. In the report that we are having before us, Honorable Speaker, the deficit is likely to be above 703 billion Kenya shillings, which needs to be fixed. And this strategy helps us to see how we shall fix that deficit in the budget, and which strategies that the Treasury will use to fix this deficit. And it becomes very important to discuss this and understand as a House, and thanks to the fact that it's coming earlier than the budget itself, unlike last year when the opposite happened. It's important, Honorable Speaker, that we understand that there are also things within the system itself in Kenya that are creating more higher debt for us, and which can be fixed, and which this report has actually covered. When you look in the report itself on its own recommendations, on recommendation number 5, it talks about the adoption of single account by the Treasury. This is one area, even though, Honorable Mbui, you stopped there and looked like you are getting tired because we said this last year, we are saying it again, we have to continue saying this so that we hammer it until it's accepted that there's need for a single account at the Treasury. Because how often, Honorable Speaker, are we borrowing money when we have our own money in different banks, which is our own money? We realized during the committee sittings that there were very many case studies where the government has money or has borrowed money, and that money is deposited in banks. It stays there for more than even 5 years, and those banks still lend to the government in form of treasury bonds and treasury bills, such that the government of Kenya then ends up borrowing its own money, which it borrowed from outside at a higher interest rate, has given to a department or a ministry in this country. That money goes to a bank, and then it's again lent to the government as local borrowing form of treasury bonds and treasury bills. So it is making our borrowing even escalate for no proper reason. And therefore the need to create a single account by the Treasury, this cannot be left out. Even if we repeated it last year, we have to hammer it down so that it is done. Another case study, Honorable Speaker, which is making our borrowing to escalate are the cases of commitment fees on loans and the timelines for disbursing the loans. We also saw within the committee sittings that so many loans have been given to Kenya by several institutions, but the Treasury has not utilized those loans. Somewhat, the country still pays something called commitment fees on these loans, and this commitment fees continues to be paid year in, year out, despite the fact we have not used those loans, and that escalates our borrowing, which is not good. So I would be asking that as we go into this session, we go slow on committing ourselves to taking loans, which we are not ready to use them. As the time goes, as I conclude, I should also speak on the issue of the various loans which are with us, we have taken, but unfortunately we are not using them, and therefore they end up being expensive. Like the earlier speakers said, as we do borrow, sometimes we end up borrowing loans that are more expensive to pay cheaper loans, and that is dangerous for the deficits that we have in our budget. With those few remarks, I want to support.
The Honourable Member for Baringo North, Honourable Joseph Makilap.
They are engaging. Madam Speaker, thank you for this opportunity. I rise to support this report of my committee. Madam Speaker, public debt has become a stigma for our country, which we need to be able to have controls so that we are able to finance programs of this country without struggling to pay debts. Madam Speaker, one thing that we've realized as a committee, which some members have raised, is that there are a lot of money that are pending in various international banks that has been paid as commitment fee to the tune of about 4 billion shillings for loans that we have not received or used. Madam Speaker, you know, you are aware that the PFM Act is very clear that we borrow for development. And if you borrow for development, what is it expected? It's expected that you borrow, inject the money into the economy through some programs that in return will bring on revenue that can be used to finance the next programs. Madam Speaker, in absence of resources pumped into the economy in terms of programs like agriculture, like roads, that are meant to bring back revenue and generate revenue for the economy, Madam Speaker, you know we shall not be doing much for our country. So we support the implementation and the draft of the proposals that we as a committee have recommended to the National Treasury so that we have value for money. Could you imagine, Madam Speaker, a situation where a commitment fee to the tune of 4 billion, that is enough money to do a road from Parwesa to Koloa in my constituency. That transfers about 3 or 4 constituencies in Kenya. And the money cannot be accessed because the loan has not come forward and no money has come to the economy. Secondly, Madam Speaker, is that borrowing expensive. Madam Speaker, at the moment, we need to control and have control of the interest rates. Because at the moment, if you are in the private sector, you borrow loan at 22%. This 22% has come as a result of government, borrowing. If the government borrows from commercial banks, Madam Speaker, what does that mean? It means the commercial banks will go and loan money to the government because they are offering good interest rates, and the implication is that the private people, the people who want to do business, it has become very difficult for Kenyans, individual Kenyans and commercial enterprises to borrow, private companies to borrow from the commercial banks. The consequence of that, Madam Speaker, is if citizens and business people are not able to borrow from our own institutions, Madam Speaker, it means you will not be able to collect enough taxes to run the economy because the loans are expensive. They are not able to make money out of it. So, Madam Speaker, the proposals that we brought forward through our chairman, Madam Speaker, is that, look, for example, Madam Speaker, if you borrow to refinance another loan, it becomes a problem. So there is need now to borrow and put programs on the money. If you borrow money today from an institution, then that particular program must be indicated by National Treasury that this money goes to this particular program so that we wait for an outcome. Madam Speaker, for us to be able to grow our economy, we need to actually reduce our appetite for huge fiscal debt. Madam Speaker, we have to live within our means as a country. For us to be able to continue with our programs of this country, we must reduce the fiscal debt, because that is the source. The source of public debt in Kenya is a result of high fiscal deficit of our budget. And if we have to reduce it, then we reduce the development programs so that we live as a country within our means. If we live within our means, we are able to grow our economy using our own resources. Madam Speaker, I support the proposals and recommendations that we've done, because that will put the country in order and we'll be able to have what is called a sustainable.
The Honorable Beatrice Elachi, member for Dagoretti North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker also rise to support this report, to appreciate the work that the committee has done in terms of just looking at how we are as a country and how strained we are in terms of debt, what risks we have, and what we need to do. Madam Speaker, when you look at the report, you realize that the control of budget also brought in very, very serious insights that I think we need to ask ourselves a few questions, regardless of whether we will like her or not. But one thing she brings out very clearly is that there is no way as a government we can spend 4 or 5 billion on debt interest expenses, composed of domestic interest payments worth that money, and then again we come with 300 billion, and that's foreign interest payments worth of 1 or 5 billion. And she questions us and says, if we continue with this trend, Madam Speaker, the country is going to have itself in a distress form. What we need to ask ourselves, Madam Speaker, and Parliament has been given that opportunity to indeed interrogate all these reports, to indeed interrogate the budget. But one thing we are not coming out, Madam Speaker, which this House can help the country, is how do we come out and look at different resources that we have, be it our natural resources, Madam Speaker, our minerals, and ask ourselves, is there a way we can use our minerals to ensure we pay some of these debts, Madam Speaker? Some of these debts, Madam Speaker, we pay and we find ourselves we have not even managed to use. That we are just paying interest on something because we went and we agreed we will borrow, but even the borrowing has not arrived in the country. Time has come, especially in the last administration, that was the biggest challenge, that we have borrowed money and we are unable to spend. Then now we arrive and find ourselves with very high interest, Madam Speaker. And then we come again and we start complaining, and today we are here. We have raised everything we can, Madam Speaker, but the most important thing we need to ask ourselves, in all this, how do we now rebalance ourselves and look at the different sectors that are either ailing, sectors like our different parastatals that we have, Madam Speaker. We have to ask ourselves, we have to sit down as a country and agree. It is time we agree. There's so much that we can do in national government to find ourselves with revenues that we can take over and start dealing with this risk, with the debt that we have, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the other thing, when you read the report, the Auditor General now comes in, and again, in a way of advising government, she says very clearly that the government continues to pay commitment fees incurred on undrawn amounts regarding loans signed between the government of Kenya and foreign lenders. And then, Madam Speaker, the question now comes in. If that is what is happening, how do we now sit down and renegotiate these loans? Since we have not spent, I believe we can renegotiate. I believe there is a way we can even now sit and say, we borrow where it is cheaper, and repay all those loans and remain now with a loan that you can carry forward so that you don't strain the country the way we are, Madam Speaker. And so therefore, Treasury has to come and sit and ensure there are some loans. Do we need those loans? If indeed they were meant to do roads, they were meant to do, and now time has gone, and even some of these things have been overtaken by events, do we still need the loans should be the question. And that is one thing that when we get our budgets, Madam Speaker, we are waiting to see how Treasury is now advising us that yes, we have our budget, this is the total amount that we want to spend, but we have a framework we are bringing in on how we can relook at ourselves and work within what we have budgeted for, regardless of, I know we will say we need more money than what we want. But we are saying as a country, let us spend what we have. So, Madam Speaker, as I support this, I am waiting to see.
The Honorable Didi Nyoro.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I first of all want to thank and congratulate the Chairman, Honorable Shurie, of course with the entire committee, even with the Vice Chair, who is also a member of the Budget Committee, Honorable Dr. Makari Muru. Honorable Speaker, I'll be direct to the point because I want to highlight a few things. When we came in as Kenya Kwanza, Honorable Speaker, the President was very categorical that Kenya had to reverse the gear in terms of borrowing. And Honorable Speaker, what we are doing in the Budget Committee, alongside the Debt Committee and the Finance Committee, because we work together, is that gradually we have been able to climb down in terms of the deficit. Honorable Speaker, last financial year, Kenya had a deficit to GDP ratio of around 5.7%. Honorable Speaker, that came down around supplementary budget time. At some point we came to 4.4%, and then after the last supplementary, we came to 5.5% debt to GDP ratio. Honorable Speaker, though we'll be debating the BPS tomorrow, what we have managed to do actually for the next financial year is that the deficit has come down to from 886 billion, and we have come down to around 703.9 billion shillings, which is just around 3.9% deficit to GDP ratio, and which is a very good path, Honorable Speaker, when it comes to managing our appetite to borrow. Honorable Speaker, number two, I also want to just bring the point bare, because sometimes we read even on the newspapers on the amount of money that has been borrowed. Honorable Speaker, the truth of the matter is that Kenya never borrows monies outside of the budgeted deficit. Honorable Speaker, when we have seen an escalation of the debt portfolio, that has majorly been because our debt, which is roughly 11 trillion, 50% is debt domestic, and the other 50%, thereabout, give or take, is also foreign. 70% of our foreign debt is dollar denominated. And therefore, Honorable Speaker, what happens when the shilling has lost, let's say, 20%, then you just take the 20% and roll over to our debt portfolio, which is foreign, and therefore we may see the debt increasing, for example, by 1 trillion without borrowing a shilling, because our debt figures are given in shillings, but 50% of the debt is borrowed in external currencies. Honorable Speaker, we have also seen that whereas Kenya is adopting a conservative manner and a conservative model of borrowing rates, we have also seen some of the major economies over borrowing, Honorable Speaker. Currently, the debt in the US is over 120% debt to GDP ratio of over 34 trillion shillings, which has actually also caused a standoff in the Congress in the US. And Honorable Speaker, even in the UK, the debt to GDP ratio is over 100%. But what we are saying is that we cannot compare our economy to those of the developed economies, Honorable Speaker, because our cost is different, our use is different, and that is why we will continue to borrow less, and because we cannot afford to continue digging the hole of debt. Honorable Speaker, when we talk about debt also, we look at several things. For example, when you go to Japan, Japan has a debt to GDP ratio which is highest in the world of over 250%. But Honorable Speaker, you have to look at the cost. The cost in Kenya now to borrow domestically, just recently we had an infrastructure board of over 17%, Honorable Speaker, which is tax-free. At some point in Japan, for the last 10 years, they have had boards which yield negative, which actually have negative yield, meaning the negative interest rate. And therefore, Honorable Speaker, the more the reason we cannot compare ourselves with those. And Honorable Speaker, because of such kind of blunders, Honorable Speaker, we have been able to see, after our borrowing in Japan, this has led to deflation, and that deflation, Honorable Speaker, has led to the real GDP in Japan has remained the same for the last 30 years, Honorable Speaker, because of our borrowing and also the ramifications of our borrowing. Honorable Speaker, also, Kenya is a gross borrower and therefore does not lend to anyone. Some of these big economies, Honorable Speaker, what is reported as gross borrowing, Honorable Speaker, but they also...
The Honorable Jerry Minor, member for Kirinyaga. Oh, but hold on a moment, let me welcome a school.
Thank you.
Just give me a minute to recognize the school. I wish to recognize, seated in the public gallery, two schools, Milimani Secondary School from Naivasha constituency, Nakuru County, and another school, Nairobi River Primary and Junior Secondary from Embakasi West constituency, Nairobi County. And before you proceed, Honorable Maina, let me allow Honorable Mark Mwenje to welcome the team.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, let me take this opportunity to welcome the students, JSS students of Nairobi River Primary from Embakasi West. I want to thank the school for the splendid job they've been doing. Honorable Speaker, we'll be doing additional classrooms in that school, about 4 classrooms for JSS. And it's good the students are here to see this is where we get funds to build for them. So I want to encourage them, and I believe up there are future members of parliament who will come here someday. Thank you, Honorable Speaker. And on behalf of the entire House, let me welcome all the students in the galleries. Thank you.
Thank you. May I proceed, Honorable Njeri Maina?
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. I rise to support the report by the committee. Honorable Speaker, this House owes a fiduciary duty to the electorate. Honorable Speaker, it is therefore important to examine our medium-term debt management strategy so that we can ensure that any monies are applied accordingly. Honorable Speaker, the ideal situation is that the net external borrowing does not exceed 55% and the domestic borrowing does not exceed 45%. Honorable Speaker, we must therefore examine what are the key priority areas that need funding by this House. Honorable Speaker, we must also continue to ensure that there is a continuity in government projects. Honorable Speaker, cutting down over recurrent expenditure is also something that we should examine. Honorable Speaker, on the fiscal policy that we have must also reflect on the financial constraints of this nation. And that is what I call walking the talk. Honorable Speaker, since the Kenya Kwanza government took office, we have actually borrowed less. I want to disabuse the notion that we have borrowed more as a Kenya Kwanza government. And I want to refer to my good colleague and friend, Honorable Ndindi Nyoro, that what happens is that when the shilling depreciates, the value, and around 70% of our debt is in US dollars, obviously increases, and that is the net effect that we see in the increase of our debt. Honorable Speaker, it is not about the debt. It is about whether the debt is sustainable. Countries like the USA have a debt that is around over 128% of the GDP. As of 2023, they had more than 32 trillion US dollars in debt. Honorable Speaker, the question that we must continuously examine is whether we have a sustainable debt and whether we are able to manage the same for posterity. Honorable Speaker, the G7 nations like Canada, Germany, and the rest have net debt of around 128%, Honorable Speaker. So we must continuously engage in this conversation to ensure that we examine policies that also do not denigrate our development agenda, but ensure that for posterity we sustain the same and are able to pay our debt. Thank you, Honorable Speaker.
The Honorable Donya Doris, member for Kisii.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to support this because there's a time I was a board member at Wendo sugar milling, and I saw over 100 vehicles which are not used. Those are government assets. So I imagined if you moved around the country and you identified the government assets which are not being used, these assets can be sold, Madam Speaker. They make the process more quick so that these, the money that is collected from the government assets can be used to run government activities. Anytime there is borrowing, they say we have to fund such activity, we have to fund such activity, forgetting that we have our own where we can collect this money and make it run these government projects or government activities. Another thing, Madam Speaker, each borrowing must have a purpose that is serving and an approval. If today I took some loan from any bank in Kenya, I will be given a limit on when to pay that loan and the interest and the purpose and the time that I have to pay for it. So we are never clear on what we want, but it is easy to borrow from other places than to allow a government to give a clear procedure, Madam Speaker, on how they can have its idle assets sold so that we can limit on the amount of money that we are borrowing. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honorable Member for Manyata, John Gitonga.
Thank you. Thank you, Honorable Speaker. I'll start by saying that a nation's strength ultimately consists of what it can do on its own and not what it can do, it can borrow from others. Honorable Speaker, around 13 years ago, our debt was less than 1 trillion. Honorable Speaker, right now we are talking of close to 11.25 trillion. And Honorable Speaker, we actually need to borrow less as we move forward. Because, Honorable Speaker, the population that we are leading, the next generation must not find this country in crisis in form of debt, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, I want to congratulate the report done by the Committee on Debt and say that, Honorable Speaker, we actually as a House need to be more keen on the issues of borrowing in this country, Honorable Speaker, and more keen also, Honorable Speaker, on the programs that we are borrowing to finance. And I propose, as we look at this issue of debt and how we are handling our debt, Honorable Speaker, we need to put in audit, especially well-trusted auditors, even internationally, Honorable Speaker, to check on the viability of the programs and projects that we are funding with debts. And Honorable Speaker, that will help us to be able to get value for money, because we are net borrowers. So we cannot say we will not live without borrowing. But let us borrow and ensure we maximize on the opportunities and the value for money as we continue doing the same. Honorable Speaker, I'll deviate a little bit and go back to the borrowing in Kenya right now and say that, Honorable Speaker, and call upon the Treasury to look at the interest rates that our local debts, our banks are giving to the normal business people. Honorable Speaker, right now, if you're doing business, 20% and you borrow from bank, 20% goes of your profit goes to what you are making in any business. And that means, Honorable Speaker, we are having a problem with even people financing their own operations. I call upon Treasury to check on that, and I understand the issue of inflation, but it's important to have local solution, especially for our businesses, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, we also need to review, and it's good to always say we are a working and a thinking nation. We passed the finance bill last year, and there are some things that are working, others need improvement, others need to be rethought. While we are preparing to do another budget in June and read another finance bill, Honorable Speaker, some of the taxes that we introduced, and we were very keen to increase on our collection, some of the things have not worked right. It's important we review that as a House, ensure we come up with ways of raising revenue that are not too much into killing the businesses that are being operated in this country. Honorable Speaker, I also want to say that even some of the taxes, especially the turnover tax, that we have introduced to our farmers, it is also important as a House, because we are also a thinking House, to see how we are going to reprieve that and reduce what is required for our farmers, Honorable Speaker, so that we also don't have a case where farmers are getting frustrated, going to internet and trying to solve issues, Honorable Speaker. As I close, Honorable Speaker, I want to say that we need to work on the savings that this country is accumulating. And I'm happy that the government we have today has come out strongly to see how we can improve on our savings so that we stop borrowing too much from the foreign entities and getting crushed by paying by the dollar and work with our Kenyan shillings. Then we can negotiate on issues of our interest rate so that, Honorable Speaker, we can have this country figured out as we move on, Honorable Speaker. And that is my submission as I still congratulate the committee. Thank you.
Honorable Rindikiri Mugambi. It's out of the House. The Honorable Geoffrey Ruku, MP from Bere North. Not in the House. The Honorable Dr. Robert Pukos, MP for Endebess. You want to contribute to this?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to contribute to the policy and the financial resolutions relating to the 2024 medium debt management strategy. Honorable Speaker, just on the onset, this strategy talks about that at least 2 months before the end of the current financial year, the National Treasury submits to the National Assembly the annual borrowing plan that addresses any deviations from the 2024 medium-term debt strategy in financing the 2024-2025 budget estimates, attendant costs and risks of the deviations, and policy measures to address. That in order to help the enhanced public participation in public debt matters, the National Treasury publishes simplified, citizen-friendly documents to accompany the technical reports on public debt submitted to the National Assembly. As you are aware, Honorable Speaker, many people at times they don't understand some of the technical terms used in some of these reports. And therefore, it will be very important that the Treasury publishes simplified, citizen-friendly documents to accompany the technical reports on public debt submitted to the National Assembly. Honorable Speaker, we also, in this report, ask that the country's borrowing strategy approved at 55%, that is +5 for net external borrowing and 45% for net domestic borrowing, as contained in a 2024 medium-term debt management strategy. And we should be able to have fiscal policies that gives us some discipline so that we don't deviate so much, Honorable Speaker. We've seen that in our use of Article 223 of to work on the expenditure by the government that was unplanned for, where we are able to spend and then be able to look at what is our collections. I think that is very important, such that we don't spend beyond what we are able to collect. We must stick within certain level of our discipline, certain fiscal policies, that we don't go beyond where we have to now come into the supplementary estimates and try to cut on our costs, so that when we make our budget should be limited and within limits that we are able to collect within our expenditure. Because, Honorable Speaker, when you go even to the supermarket, you spend what you have in your pocket. You don't spend what you don't have in your account. So I think it is important for us as a country that we must have fiscal policies, fiscal discipline, that we can be able to spend within our means and not over-borrow, so that we don't borrow what we are not able to service. With those few remarks, Honorable Speaker, I support.
Daniel Manduku.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From the onset, let me inform the House that I'm a member of the Public Debt Committee. But even after sitting in that committee, it is my wish to see that the National Treasury adheres to their own proposal as stipulated in the medium-term debt strategy. Mr. Speaker, it's ironical that the National Treasury proposes a borrowing mix of 55 being foreign and 45 being local, and yet in the budget policy statement, what they are planning to borrow this year is 63 to 37%. Further to that, Mr. Speaker, this House some time back resolved that the debt anchor be 55%. A few months down the line, today, our debt anchor to GDP is at 69%. Would have wished to see a situation where this debt anchor gradually starts going down towards the target of 55%. The National Treasury has promised that they should achieve this anchor by June 2028. I think this House needs to sanction the National Treasury strongly so that periodically they are obligated to come and give reports on a quarterly basis. Mr. Speaker, there's also a problem with our debt in that even if it is borrowed, there's no rule or law on how it is applied in terms of development versus recurrent. Any good economist will tell you that debt should strictly be applied to development expenditure. Mr. Speaker, it is very sad to see that we've borrowed a lot of money and used it on recurrent expenditure. Maybe, going forward, we also need to redefine what is recurrent vis-a-vis what is development expenditure, with special emphasis on the development of human resources. Here, Mr. Speaker, I'm thinking about teachers, doctors, and other people who help in uplifting our social status as a country. Mr. Speaker, some members keep comparing Kenya to Japan and the US, who have exceeded 100% debt to GDP ratios. But I want to remind them that, Mr. Speaker, these countries have lots of foreign reserves running into billions and billions of dollars. And they also have monies that they've lent to countries like Kenya. And so a comparison of with such countries is not appropriate. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, in all discussions that we have about public debt, we need to seriously consider having a public debt act so that it can legislate and strictly seal any loopholes where the Public Finance Management Act does not cover. And this may reduce the abuse of using Article 223 of the Constitution. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
You have Honorable Edith Nyanze. So stepped out, huh? The Honorable Dr. James Nyikal, you want to contribute to this? MP for Seme.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me this opportunity. Mr. Speaker, I must appreciate what the committee has done. Mr. Speaker, this is the second time we are actually discussing the budget management strategy during the budget process. And it's actually the first time we are doing it before the budget policy strategy, which means we are actually seriously taking up the matter of looking at our debt and linking it to our budget, because that's really where the issue lies. So, Speaker, debts on their own are not a bad thing, but what is important is what we do with the debt, and the purpose for it, and whether we achieve that, because it comes from the budget deficit, and the deficit could either be our recurrent expenditure or development. And we presume that we should say that most of the times we shouldn't borrow just for consumption to finance our recurrent expenditure, but actually for development and plan and make sure that what we spend on actually brings revenue later on. I think those are the really most important issues when we are dealing with debts. What is the source of debt? As I said earlier, basically it is a budget deficit. And it is important, and I think this report addresses it to some extent, that the budget deficit is our expenditure against our revenue. And really, if we find that we have a large budget deficit, we should now adopt the process of saying, why can't we start by actually counting the expenditure? What we do currently, that when we have a deficit, we actually go out to borrow. My view is that we should now start looking at what do we cut in our expenditure, what do we reduce in what we are going to spend. Borrowing is good, but if you are borrowing until you cannot pay back, and we have had a lot of problems in this country, the cost of living has gone up, and the big issue that's been that we are paying debts. We are paying debts, so we cannot finance our expenditure. So we must start looking at reducing our revenue. And this report, Mr. Speaker, actually has two main parts. One is a list of financial resolutions that I think are directly related to what we plan to do. That the fiscal target for medium term is approved and set at 3.9 for the year 2024 and 3.3 of the GDP for 2025 and so on. But the issue is, shall we be able to actually adhere to this? Last year, we actually were at 4%, and now we are at 5.5% of the GDP. That is our deficit. So we can put all these resolutions, but are we really going to adhere to them and make sure that we don't go beyond that? And we're also saying that the country's borrowing strategy is approved at 55% of the GDP for external borrowing and 45% for a domestic borrowing, which is a good thing. But shall we be able to stick at this? Because last time we actually put this at about 50 something, and we went up all the way to 68. So are we able to do that? Our debt to GDP, the ratio as a percentage, we also again set it at 55, and we're going to all be, we're going to be way beyond that. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, mine is this policy recommendations that have been here are key, and without them, the financial resolutions that we have put in that are in the report will not work. And I will just mention, just to Mr. Speaker, that we should encourage
Why are you saying okay? Are you done?
I'm just saying, what can I do if I have to give it 1 minute?
Will you be able to wind up if I gave you 1 minute?
So we should actually encourage public participation. When as a House, we are now realizing that we have to look at budget during the budget process, the same should apply to the public so that the public will do that. We have also said in the recommendations that we'll bring out a schedule of what we intend to do with the budget. But I also think we should bring out a schedule of what we have done with the budget, with the debt that we took in the last budget, and what have been returns with that. I think it is only then that it will have a meaning approach to the debt management. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The MP for Kitui Rural, the Honorable Devin Boni.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On onset, let me say I support this report and thank the committee for coming up with the second report. Mr. Speaker, let me also take this opportunity to thank Treasury on the way they handled the Eurobond, the payback. Mr. Speaker, the Eurobond is something which had brought a lot of anxiety in the financial markets. I remember last year when I was in Washington for the IMF World Bank talks. Everybody was looking at Kenya and saying Kenya is the next country to Zambia and Ghana in defaulting the loan. So at least I think now we are out of that hook. And you can see the Kenya shilling has appreciated against the dollars because a lot of people are holding dollars and thinking that at one point the government will be mopping up the dollars to pay the Eurobond. So at least the market for the dollar has stabilized. Mr. Speaker, this proposal in the medium-term debt strategy, they are not new. They have been there. But the question is, have they been implemented? And I'll tell you, when you look at the report, the 2023 set fiscal deficit was targeted at 4.4%. But what did we get? We got 5.5%, meaning that we are not following the proposals. And Mr. Speaker, we need to be serious as a country. If we have to fight the deficits, we have to fight the debts, we have to move towards balanced budgets. And I like the way the committee has recommended that God Treasury should submit to Parliament the list of projects which they are borrowing for. And I'll tell you currently, what we are borrowing for domestic, for recurrent expenditure. In fact, you move in the country, there are no major projects which are going on. And therefore, when a country starts borrowing for recurrent and not investing, we are doing very badly. So we need to move towards balanced budget. Two, there have been a lot of roadside promises. When you do a roadside promises, for example, by the head of state, that means that project you have promised, or he has promised, has to go to the budget. When it has to go to the budget, there are two things you have to do. One, you have to reorganize budgets. Two, you have to bring it supplementally. And when you bring it supplementally, you are increasing the budget deficit. Budget deficit is equal to borrowing. So these roadside promises, I think it's high time as a country we follow what we have promised and what is in the budget so that at least we can reduce the budget. Mr. Speaker, the use of Article 223 has been overused and abused. You remember the Auditor General and also the Control Budget reporting that billions of shillings were used under Article 223. When you use that kind of money under Article 223, then you are creating a deficit. That means the project we had budgeted for, you have to borrow because you don't have money for it. And it's high time we think about reducing that. We also need to go for concession loans, which are cheaper, as opposed to commercial loans. And we need people who can negotiate loans effectively, professional negotiators. You see, the way Eurobond was negotiated,